Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of OWASP Switzerland. So today with me here is on one hand Patty, also from OWASP Switzerland, and we also have our speaker being ready, Tony, and he will be introduced a little bit later. But first, a few words about OWASP and what's going on here for OWASP in Switzerland. So first and foremost, we have a very big announcement. So some of you that have been following OWASP Switzerland for the last years have realized that at some point there was a pandemic and we stopped, like all other organizations, having meetings that are physically on site somewhere. We also had to do that, but till now we did not come back to the physical space. We are only having for the last years now online OWASP Switzerland meetings, but we will have very soon on the 5th of June, we will have again an on-site OWASP meeting, as we will have more speakers than normal. Like normally we only have one, maybe two speakers, but we will have 4 speakers joining us for the OWASP Switzerland Summit that we had, that we named the Recharge and Reconnect event, where we would really like to have a lot of people really come together and form again the OWASP Switzerland community. We will have 4 speakers with different topics. We have everything from cloud computing. We will talk about confidential computing, also about OWASP projects, like, for example, the OWASP mobile application security project, or the projects, if you want. So there are multiple projects in that area. We will talk about that. And also we will give you more insight on how you can actually deal with the OWASP top 10, not just from like a technical perspective, but also how to really implement that in your organization, how to look at that from more like also a management perspective. So we will have technical talks, we will have more managed focus talks. So it will be a really interesting afternoon that we can offer you. It will be completely free. You can sign up right now if you want to attend. Again, it will be central in Zurich, as stated here. And also after the event, we will join for pre-conference beer, if you want to call it like that, with our friends from DEF CON Switzerland. Because as some of you might know, the day after and yet another day, so the next 2 days after our OWASP Switzerland Summit, there will be the Area 41 taking place in Zurich. An event with about 400 people from all around the globe talking about cybersecurity. So we are really excited to also have this like joint get together after our event with the DEF CON Switzerland people. So looking forward to have a lot of people there, also from the OWASP side. So please feel free to sign up for the event. As I said, it's, as most stuff in the OWASP universe, completely free of charge. So by that also, as we do that every time, if you like what we're doing, be it in OWASP Switzerland specifically or OWASP in general, if you leverage the OWASP project, you can do that for free. You can join all of our events for free. But if you think what we're doing is great, that you can use it, be it like as a security professional, be it to help you in your daily work as a software engineer, whatever it is, please also consider becoming an OWASP member. We need at least some money in the organization to make all of that happen. And with your membership, you're supporting the OWASP mission. So thanks for everyone who joins as a member. Then also, if you have any topic that you think is not that well known yet or should be more known in the community, or you're an expert in something that you want to spread the word about, feel free to always just contact us, and we are always looking for speakers. So if you have something, we will make sure that you get a slot to speak about it at the OWASP Switzerland event. Now, for today's event, just very quickly how it will go down. So first we have this introduction. Afterwards, we will have the talk from Tony. There you can either ask questions on YouTube or on our dedicated system that we provide. More on that in a second. After the talk, we will have a Q&A session, and then we will have a wrap-up. Regarding questions, as said, you can directly, assuming you're now watching on our YouTube stream, you can just ask any question at any time that you might have for Tony there. But we also have on their OWASP-Switzerland.ch, we have a Q&A platform. The main reason for that being is that we noticed that a lot of you guys are not that comfortable in asking with your account publicly questions on the internet that stays there. We allow through OWASP-Switzerland.ch, we allow you to post anonymous questions. So feel free also to ask your questions there if you feel more comfortable about that. We will monitor both platforms and make sure that Tony can answer all your questions at the end. And by that, I'm really happy to introduce Tony to you. Tony will talk about threat modeling with reliable data today. Really excited to hear more about the topic. It's a really important topic. And by that, I'm handing over, and I guess you can introduce yourself best, handing it over to Tony. Thanks for being here.
Sounds good, Sven. Much appreciated. And thanks to you, Patty, as well. And thanks to the OWASP Switzerland chapter. Great to partake again in the OWASP community. I run the OWASP Atlanta chapter. And from Atlanta to Switzerland, our thanks for this opportunity to be able to talk about something really important. And that is leveraging reliable data to build good and effective threat models. So we're going to talk about, data integration. We're going to talk about quality of data in fueling reliable threat models that you might be doing within your respective organizations. Now, first, just a little brief intro on myself. Like I mentioned, I am the OWASP Atlanta chapter leader in concert with 3 other great individuals here in Atlanta for the OWASP Atlanta chapter. And I've been doing that for about 15, 16 years. I'm also the founder and CEO of a company called VerSprite. We're a global cybersecurity consulting firm. We're based out of Atlanta. I am the author of that book there that's on the screen, Risk-Centric Threat Modeling. It's a book that really it's 2 books in one. It's the first half of it is about threat modeling in general. Second half of it is about a methodology that me and Marco Morana came up with called PASTA. You may have heard of it, Process for Attack Simulation and Threat Analysis. The book itself, it was actually, the preface was written by the cybersecurity czar of the White House. A lot of the first part of the book talks about the history of threat modeling, lending from like military roots, ballistic threat models, etc. So that's really cool that we have the cybersecurity, the former cybersecurity czar of the White House, to be able to write the preface for the book. A lot of my mentioning of things in this presentation is going to come from really a lot of different roles and experiences, both as a former CISO, as a developer, as someone that's worked in enterprise security in different industries. Last but not least, if you like a good, just comic relief, but also a lighthearted understanding of like, okay, what is PASTA? PASTA stands for the Process for Attack Simulation and Threat Analysis. You can Google pasta YouTube and you can see me there in Chef White's. I am literally cooking fresh pasta and making a metaphor on how to use the threat modeling methodology. So anyway, have fun with that. All right, let's get started on some of the good stuff. Let's first talk about some of the obligatory primers in threat modeling. Let's cover some of the basics. We begin with some of the taxonomy of terms. So I'm not going to read this in very boring detail, but on the screen, you have things of what we're protecting, like an asset or a component. Sometimes this can be referred to as a component. You obviously have threats in a threat model. Oftentimes, we forget that we actually should have threats in our threat model, right? We have our other things like attack patterns, but we forget to actually think about what is the actual threat. Now, threats are all, like in real life, right? A threat is a possible menace. And usually there's a vulnerability that a threat actor want to exploit when they want to conduct a threat. For example, wouldn't see like a, somebody that is a prominent MMA fighter known internationally to be probably attacked by, some sort of like 6-year-old who's very angry, right? Because there isn't the weakness there. So we have to understand in terms of data, what is the threat relevance to things like vulnerability, attacks, even some of the defensive natures like countermeasures. Some other things like use and abuse cases in our application models. One of the things that's very unique with Pasta, and we'll get into that in a second, is that first, if you've ever hacked anything, whether it be, an old, gaming console, or some other, maybe even like a point of sale system or something like that, you basically want to understand function, right? So that's where use cases and features and products comes in. And we have to understand how things work. And there's a lot of data there. What does the product do? How does it work? What's the security context? So as we go through this presentation and think about data, right, we really want the data of everything that we address today to come alive. Other quick taxonomies that we might reference during the presentation: abuse cases. When there's uses, there's abuses. And those abuses can happen over different vectors, over a broad surface, that represents the application attack surface. And then, you have things like actor. What is the actor? That is the threat actor, but also what is the actor of the user that is maybe, leveraging some of the use cases in your application product. Last but not least, impact, right? When it comes to risk-centric threat models, impact is very important. And it's not a cybersecurity impact. Oftentimes in cybersecurity, we as a community, we think about our own selfish cybersecurity risks, cybersecurity impacts, but without understanding, wait, this threat model is an application threat model for a product that our business is selling. So we have to understand what is the impact to the product owner, the overall business, and stuff like that. All right, let's go beyond this. And now let's talk about some misconceptions, right? And some of this is going to be probably a little bit abrasive, but if you've ever seen a talk from me online or have seen me do a talk in person, I'm not really one to pull punches. So here's some ones that usually have rubbed people the wrong way. DFDs are not threat models, right? They're data flow diagrams. And oftentimes if you do a data flow diagram, you're not done. Right? Why aren't you done? Well, because DFDs are very useful for seeing how use cases and call flows, maybe data flows, are represented in your application model, but they themselves are not a threat model. And, another key point here, just to kind of really iron out before we dive into the presentation, some other misconceptions. An attack surface isn't the full extent of your basically threat model, right? So if you identify an attack surface, many people will stop there. But again, remember what I said before, what is the actual threats to that attack surface, right? So you have to go and make sure that you reconcile what you're protecting to what's actually menacing your environment. Really quick, risk and impact are two different things. Oftentimes in security, I think it's, maybe because there's so much religious warfare on risk, honestly, that we oftentimes conflate a lot of terms together. And risk and impact are very different things, right? Impact is going to be, why should I even care, in simple terms? And the risk is going to be really the combination of like, what is possible to happen that's bad? What vulnerabilities will give way to that? And what would be the impact if some of those bad things were to actually happen? So they're very different things. Speaking about misused synonyms, threat and attacks. Oftentimes when we do threat models, you see a lot of conversations that say like, oh, we have there's a phishing threat. Well, phishing is actually an attack pattern, right? You don't do phishing and then you're like, hey, we did phishing, right? If you're a cyber criminal, if you're a syndicate, if you're a nation state, phishing, there's a means to an end. So we have to understand that there's attacks and attack taxonomies and attack data that we can leverage in a threat model. There's also threat libraries that we want to leverage in a threat model. And last but not least, you can't threat model what you don't know. So it's important to be able to know the full stack of what you're protecting. And oftentimes when we threat model, especially when we use different types of very simple mnemonics that we'll get into in a second, that we basically feel that we have, really done a good job of understanding threats. Speaking of threats, right? Let's dive into the differentiator a little bit more between threats and attacks, just to kind of level set again. So a threat is a possibility in every language. And, there's a couple languages that I'm proficient in and fluent in. And in every language that I know, most of them are Latin-based, but there is, it's a possibility of a menace, right? It's not conclusive that something is going to happen. An attack is actually something that is launched that is done in support of a threat, right? So we want to be able to make sure that as we do things like threat modeling, if we go back to military roots where they've done, threat modeling for a very long time, they are using these terms, accurately and correctly. Now, we've done away with some of the throwing shade, as we say in the United States, on some of the misconceptions. We've level set on some terms. Let's talk about some of the benefits, okay? And some of these benefits really should be pretty apparent for anyone that has been drawn to this topic today. There's two historic or inherent groups of people that have benefited from threat modeling: developers and architects. And usually that conversation has been led by a security champion within, some product group or space or company. And developers, they're very busy. They have a lot of feature requests to be able to build into their sprints. They're working off of a backlog. And so they don't have a lot of time. But what they want to know is, like, they always say, tell me what I need to know so I can just build in the mitigations or not make these sort of coding mistakes in my product, in my use cases that I'm building out. Right. So they just want to know, what sort of things realistically do I need to worry about? Architects, similarly, as they're taking a lot of different, efforts from development teams, they're having to say, okay, what is maybe the authorization model or auditing controls that I want present, or logging efforts? What do I want to log? How do I want to log it? Security context of users in my application environment, so I don't have like privilege escalation concerns in my overall environment. And then other types of things like implicit trust. Implicit trust is a big one architecturally to find out as you have, a scoped out application threat model. You want to make sure that calls between component A and component B are not being elevated because you have this implicit trust where they're just sharing information, but you don't know if component A was actually compromised. Maybe it was compromised because of a vulnerable library, or maybe there was an insider, or whatever the case may be. Implicit trust is one of the major benefits in doing threat modeling, so you can understand where you need to tighten up levels of authorization validation and things like that. So a lot of the things on the list really, should resonate with a lot of, the audience members, especially if you've done, application threat modeling. Now, with risk-centric threat models using PASTA, it's really about, there's different models out there, right? There's asset-centric approaches, there's security-centric approaches. PASTA is a risk-centric approach. And it basically says, okay, I've been doing application security for a long time. I know there's a plethora of different vulnerabilities at the different layers of my application stack. So let me focus on the things that are most important, right? It doesn't negate vuln management. It doesn't negate pen testing. It doesn't negate dynamic analysis, static analysis activities. What it does is it actually funnels them in, and it says, I want to be able to prove that I have a problem for my audiences of developers, and I want it for my architects and for my engineers that are actually building out the environment. So there's we add the engineer column here under PASTA benefits, because oftentimes when we traditionally talk about like doing threat modeling with other types of approaches, like let's say Stride, you are mostly looking at what you're writing in terms of code, but you're not really looking at the full stack of your application: cloud infrastructure, network components, third-party authorization servers, third-party authentication servers, et cetera, et cetera. So oftentimes the conversations historically with Stride has been like, what are you writing? What are you building? And let's look at that over 6 different buckets. Okay, so you might be wondering, all right, what is this pasta you're talking about? And I'm hungry, so give me more. All right, so really simple. This is really not meant to be a pasta talk. We're going to dive into why is data important in threat models in general. We are going to see how data can feed into risk-centric threat models using pasta, but really simple. The blue is functional. When you want to do a threat model and you want to understand what your application is doing, right? That's the functional aspect. Why do I care? Step one. What am I running? Step two. And how does it communicate? Step three. Really simple. And then in terms of data, if I were to use the magnifying glass here and just kind of zoom in on just the kind of the blue area, right? This is the functional analysis of a product or an application. Look at all the opportunities for data, right? So you might have context of a product that's a healthcare product, and you want to have a go-to-market strategy, and maybe there's a regulatory hurdle that you have to jump. Well, that's data, because that regulatory hurdle says if you're going to sell something in the United States, you need to get clearance from the Food Drug Administration, as an example. And so the Food Drug Administration says that if you're going to collect patient health information, or you're going to be an implantable or a wearable or an injectable or whatever, you need to be able to have these considerations for patient safety, which actually trumps, protecting the data. Patient safety first in healthcare, at least. So these are requirements, and that's data, right? That data, how is that being fed into your threat model? So this is an example of data. Other examples of importance, let's go back to stage one. Maybe you're developing a financial services app, and the financial services app is providing, let's say, EPS values for stocks for the trading floor or something. So uptime is kind of important, right? You need those information pretty readily. So if you do not have that information, how does that affect your overall business model, right? Would the business owner of that product be very happy if it was down for 3 days? Probably not. So in every one of these activities within the stages of pasta, right? And the blue is functional, the red is dysfunctional or adversarial in nature. You have opportunities where you can feed your model with intel, threat data, alerts, threat intel, advisories, et cetera, et cetera. And we're going to go into that in much more detail. So this is pasta. We'll get into a little bit more on that a little bit later if you're interested in that. But let's keep moving and talk about the data deprivation that exists in threat models. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about inherency in terms of the problem. The problem statement is the following. Threat models are data starved. Okay. So let's take a look at some of the status quo today. Number one is that a lot of simplistic threat categorization mnemonics have just simply stayed at the software layer. So in terms of data, concerns about, well, how does my product reside in the network? How does my product reside in the cloud infrastructure? What IAM policies or permissions are present, not present in there? All of these things I'm mentioning, and those three categories, are opportunities for data integration. So today, in the status quo, the information that we obtain, right, when we do threat modeling, if we're using these mnemonics, it's like, okay, I'm going to use Stride. So my data frame of what is a threat or threat categorization is spoofing, tampering of data, et cetera. I'm also going to talk about use cases, maybe in a war room, right, where I'm doing a lot of whiteboarding, and I talk about, okay, what are the use cases that we want to enumerate? Great. What are the identified components? Again, same format. Maybe you find a lot of components in your application threat model that you find through these sort of tabletop discussions. Data quality on the threat model relies on the quality of discovery efforts. So if you have a bad security champion or someone kind of moderating it, not asking the right questions, it's going to be weaker data going into your model. Let's talk about call or data flow analysis. Again, the main format or vehicle for obtaining that data of understanding call flow. What is component A sharing with component B? Is it a push? Is it a pull in terms of an application call? All those things are typically done, in terms of data discovery efforts over a tabletop. But notice that all the things that are bulleted there are software application focused. So if you think about data, right, we have a lot of auxiliary areas of data that are missed, right? That relates to your infrastructure, your network, your third-party services that you might be integrating with your product, et cetera. Now, what are things that are not typically feeding some of the more traditional threat modeling approaches today? Well, threat intel. So we'll get into a kind of a funny slide in a second, but threat intel, threat data, vuln scans, software composition analysis scans, your linting efforts with code reviews, your dynamic application testing for viable exploit patterns that could support a threat assertion in your threat library, cloud infrastructure gaps from a CSPM tool, and lastly, you might be using a continuous attack surface management tool, which is telling you, oh, your environment is actually growing. Someone in DevOps just fired off, a couple of new S3 buckets, right, that are basically pulling in data from your overall product flow. So did you know? Did you not know? And so there's a lot of opportunities where data is not feeding into these threat models. A little bit more on Stride. So 1993, I think it's actually 1999, Stride was actually developed. Beautiful child, Stride was, very cute, beautiful bike, great Christmas toy, very functional, very shiny. But the reality is that was 1999 or so. It was definitely, I think, in the 1990s. Benefits, simple to use, easy to remember, quick, repeatable process, and a great way to prevent threats in software across those six categories, right? Spoofing, tampering of data, repudiation, information disclosure, denial of service, and elevation of privileges. Now, we're in 2024. So imagine that same child on that, kind of an altered version of that bike. And it's not as cool anymore, right? It's just not as hip and not really as up to date. There's a lot of things that are not feeding it. So we're in 2024, okay? And there's a lot of things that have happened since in the 1990s. And there's a lot of types of current threats that we're facing in the enterprise that we simply do not feed into our threat model. So we need to be able to feed our threat models and really go beyond, some of the things that we're facing today. Extortion, for example, where do you put that in Stride, right? Where do you put persistence? Are there interested hacker groups, nation states that are looking to persist in in your environment? Absolutely today. So it doesn't make sense to have a model of threats that doesn't factor in the threat intel, threat data. All right. So what we want to do is we want to go from being a weakling type of malnourished threat model, right, to be able to feed the information that we need. So I already kind of said there's a lot of opportunities for like incident data as an example. We're actually going to go through later on in this presentation 2 case studies. One is with a consumer product, and one is with a telecom giant, where incidents or events kind of tell you if there's warning signs or maybe pre-existing conditions that you need to focus on. Maybe some threats in your threat model need to be bolstered up in terms of priority because maybe other industry players have been victimized by that particular threat campaign that's running. So nourishing the threat model, data-enriched threat models, there's a lot of opportunities where we can leverage in a lot of security activities today. Some of you might be wondering, well, this sounds like a lot of work. The work is already being done. In large enterprises, you have GRC teams that maybe have business impact analysis defined and done. You might have tools that are basically that you're ingesting in your application product environment that are sharing a software bill of materials. There's opportunities with tomorrow's technology with natural language processing and images described in DFDs where you can take binary images and then have that served as data. So you can take, conversations, have that pushed into a natural language processing model to extrapolate it and feed a threat model. And there's some tools that are actually doing that today. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But pen tests, exploit DB, sources where you're calling something a threat and you might have an underlying attack. Well, is that attack actually being exploited in the wild? How many campaigns in sticks format is that actually, being found through Mandiant feeds or through recorded future feeds or through open CTI feeds, etc. So the key thing here is we need to nourish the threat models. Otherwise, we're really doing a lot of disservice. And I think I went back versus forward, but let's take a look at this honeycomb here. And this kind of really exemplifies how in large organizations, let's say you're in you work for Credit Suisse, right? One iconic Swiss company. Credit Suisse has groups and members and partners that do a lot of these things, right? And so a lot of these things that are in the honeycomb provide data output. Think about, if you've been in security, how the longevity of that output and where it kind of dies on the vine. It just goes into remediation queues, but it has an opportunity to feed into your application threat model, if it's contextual to the attack surface that you're actually threat modeling. Now, from a broader perspective, those of you that know the OSI model know that there's playfully a layer 8, right? That's sometimes called the management layer. And one of the things that, threat modeling is a very collaborative process. Many of you already know this. But how you message what is important is really is critical. So when we as security people say things like, in a security vernacular, then like, oh, sandbox escaping in our product is a problem, right? This is a threat. The product owner, the people further up in the business chain are going to be like, say what? You want to be able to reconcile sandbox escaping as an attack pattern to an actual threat that you're trying to defend. And when you're building a threat library on your own, and this is a great exercise, right? Because it allows everyone in a room to kind of think nefariously. And you want to speak in a way that begins with, I want to, and then role play something nefarious. Like, I want to steal your data. I want to sabotage your network. I want to deface your site. I want to, reside on your network and things like that. So that then when you find a problem with sandbox escaping, you can say things like sandbox escaping is viable and supports threat F, which is I want to obtain your customer account information, because maybe I want to go from one tenant environment to another tenant environment in your SaaS product. So that's a little bit about the problems of malnourished threat models, because of the absence of data. Let's talk about how we feed this, okay? So in a risk-centric approach, right, you have different stages of this approach and methodology where you can really bring in, let's take a look at threat analysis. Threat analysis, really simply, you can take threat intel, advisories that you're subscribing to. In the financial community, you might go to FSISAC. If you have tech infrastructure, maybe you subscribe to ITISAC. There is maybe incident data that you get from our friends at first.org, right? First.org is mining and collecting a lot of incident data, incident response cases and things like that. There's tons of information. So to contextualize and say that for your industry, or maybe for your technology that you're running, right? There's multiple ways where you can take activities in a risk-centric approach like PASTA and say in stage 4, I want to feed in good data. I want to feed in reliable data, but I want to feed it in from incidents that the industry is seeing or things that are advisories that are affecting components in my attack surface. So most of the time, if you're, again, like a big company, like let's say Credit Suisse or a major enterprise, you're already subscribing to threat intel reports. The problem that I've been seeing for a long time is that those sort of data ingestions, you receive the reports and they don't get operationalized, especially into an application threat model or even an organizational threat model. So the idea here is, and I can go on and on, honestly, just on this, there's on attack modeling. Like if you're going to, build a threat library on what you're concerned about, let's say you're concerned about 3 things. You're concerned about information disclosure, persistence, and sabotage. Well, then you look at what are the affected components, right, in your application model that would be, that might have vulnerabilities. So this now brings up the conversation of what vulnerabilities, application-wise, infrastructure-wise, CVEs, CWEs, do I have that would actually allow for sabotage of my platform to happen or information disclosure to happen, right? If I have a CWE that is tied to a relational database that allows for information to be extracted illicitly, then, that supports my threat in my threat model. So, risk-centric approaches provide a lot of opportunities in each one of those stages. This is a great representation to say where in your organization can you start to feed data that supports network-related intel, network-related attacks, network-related incidents, weaknesses in software. It could be, design-related. It could be code-related. We already talked a lot about threat intel. We haven't talked a lot about threat data, and we'll go through a case study in telecom on that. But threat data, is things like events and incidents that your SOC is actually monitoring. I used to be a SOC analyst with a headset. I've done the first shift, second shift, third shift, and you're looking at alerts from insert your favorite SIM nowadays. So why not look at what you're trying to respond to in the context of an application threat model or an organizational threat model? If you understand the threat model for what you're protecting, you're going to look at those alerts coming from whatever, QRadar, Splunk, Sumo Logic, it doesn't matter, in a different way, right? You're not just simply responding to and being dictated on what to do by a tool. And so there's an opportunity for data to be able to change how we even respond and behave within our own respective jobs. Here's a simple threat library. You might be wondering, okay, you talked a lot about how some of these mnemonics like Stride really are kind of immutable since the 1990s. Show me like something that's a little bit more, fresh, some fresh pasta, if you will. Well, here's a custom threat library. So for telecom, in telecom, there's some things that are agnostic, like, who doesn't want to distribute malware? So whether it's telecom or a retailer or a bank, if I can get on their infrastructure, I want to distribute malware. So that's what I call a agnostic threat assertion in a threat library. But there's other things like disruption of service, right? A lot of adversarial groups back in the 10 years ago, there was an active campaign by Collective Armada to be able to do denial of service to a lot of ISPs, and so that it could affect the tenants in those ISPs. And so thinking about what is going to affect the business or the product is how you get to something like this. This is a custom threat library. No threat library is going to be the same. We'll get to industry threat libraries that you can actually use and leverage at the end of the presentation. But let's talk about some case studies. I promised some case studies and now they're here. So let's take a look about some case studies where, maybe having used, I'm sure they didn't do any threat modeling, but let's take a look at a consumer product. This is a really simple one, but let's take a look at how understanding data in a threat model, making sure that it is well examined before developing and deploying the solution could have actually saved the company, because this particular company, I think, went out of business. Cloud Pets was owned by a parent company. Of course, we're going to first understand, what do we care about? The overall premise of the product, just for background, is that there's this nice, teddy bear that has the ability to be able to talk to your child, read a story in your voice or someone else's voice, maybe mom's voice, maybe dad's voice, maybe Uncle Leo's voice. And, they are basically reading a story they can follow along, etc. All right. So as you can imagine, let's talk about reliable data in our threat model. Well, first of all, stage one of PASTA says, what do we care about? If we're developing this, consumer product, we care about, child safety, right? We care about that the teddy bear doesn't start to go into like a vicious tirade on poor little Bobby, right, as they're trying to go to bed, or say, I don't know, some sort of like cultish things at night, right? And then little Bobby will have like psychiatric therapy in like 2 years. But we also care about, there's going to be personal information, right? There's parents' emails, maybe even physical addresses and stuff like that. So we can stop there, right? Those are two things that we care about as a business. Great. That's data, though. That's fueling what we're protecting, what we care about. Because as we build our threat model, we want to reconcile to the things that we care about. So, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this DFD. There's obviously things that the product does. There's a mobile component. There's an IoT component in the teddy bear. There is an infrastructure component. What are we running? It had a relational backend MongoDB that wasn't protected. But if you basically do stage 2 of Pasta that basically says, hey, what am I running and how does it work? Stage 3 in terms of what are the call flows, then maybe I can start to think about what sort of abuse cases that I don't want happen that violate what I just said in terms of my objectives in stage 1, which is I don't want personal information disclosure, right? As one of the business objectives that I mentioned there. So in this case, there was a lot. What actually happened here, there was a huge misconfiguration in the cloud environment, in the MongoDB environment, and there was a lot of data records that were basically, spilt. But there's a lot of there could have been a lot of opportunities in going through a risk-centric approach and having data of like, what am I running? What are my call flows? What is my controls that I have, right? All this is data. Some of it's binary data, some of it's contextual data that's qualitative in nature. But this data allows us to start to map out a logical possibility of how my concerned threat of like, I'm concerned that I don't want personal information disclosed. So then I start to map it. Okay, well, what are the places where I have personal information? And I have a database, and that has a lot of personal information. And then I have what sort of weaknesses could I have, right? And we have the opportunity to relate, different taxonomies in the industry like CWE and KPEC to feed the threat model with reliable data. Case study number 2, telecom. This is a case study on threat intel that feeds in stage 4 of Pasta. So there was 6 newsworthy security incidents that happened since 2008. You'd figure, usually if you live in a house or in a neighborhood and you see some egregious things happen in your neighborhood, you're going to perk up and pay attention. And so again, data, right? Prior events and incidents allow for, you to be able to say, hey, I need to pay attention. We begin with Verizon. The data that we have here is like, what does Verizon have in terms of goals? Some of these are goals that are manifested to investors, to board of directors, to, things like that. And they also talk about some of their infrastructure, right? Where they're moving to from a technology standard standpoint. Another MongoDB egg on the face story. I'm not going to get into details on that, but there was a lot of cases over time in a lot of threat intel that said the telecom industry was going to go through a lot of problems. So it provided a lot of threat data that they went through over 6 years, where they had breach after breach after breach, where all those incidents. So if you go through like an incident, you usually have one of the last phases in an IR methodology is called lessons learned. And that can really feed into your threat model in terms of data. So this is just showing another opportunity where you can operationalize both threat data. What is my infrastructure screaming at me about? What are my alerts in my incidents in my SIM telling me about? And then what do I need to be able to substantiate in my threat model? Maybe I'm going to elevate a threat assertion up in my threat library so that my threat model is contextual, it's relevant, and it's very data-fed, data-rich. This is talking about threat intel. So threat intel is information or data that you get from the outside, threat advisories, and then threat data is things that your infrastructure is screaming to you about problems in the environment, maybe abuse cases or possible events that are actually turning into incidents. So I mentioned taxonomies in the industry today, especially since we're all OWASP fellows here. We have, obviously the great project of the application security verification standard, right? Hundreds of countermeasures controls that we can map to be our countermeasure library. I always say that threat modeling is a marriage of libraries: attack library, post-exploitation library, countermeasure libraries, vulnerability library, right? And then of course you have your attack surface, which is what your attack surface tools or maybe your conversations will say, these are the things that are running in my environment that I care about. And of course, your organically developed threat library. We look at this example here of extortion, and how does extortion happen within a given environment. But if we want to be able to substantiate the viability of extortion and say, hey, there's a component that could be affected and it's attached to like 10 different vulnerability nodes, and those nodes have 20 different associated attack patterns, now we start to have a very data rich and reliable threat model to which we can speak to a lot of different interested groups. I will close with some what's changing, and you might be interested in this, how to enrich this. And there's a free community product called Fork that we've given to the industry. You can go to forktm.com. That's forkthreatmodeling.com, but it's forktm.com. And these are some snapshots on basically meant to basically say, if you're going to build a data rich threat model, you can go through this process, right, of 7 steps, and you can basically, provide answers, or, and you see there's a lot of mappings already. So all the taxonomies, some of them from OWASP, some of them from OASIS with sticks, some of them from, MITRE, basically all of them from MITRE. You have these mappings, so you have threat motive, component, associated CWE, what is the associated KPEC, what is the post-exploitation pattern, what is the mitigation language on the, what are the campaigns that are out there in the wild that are actually, supporting some of the attack patterns that we've correlated to the threat. And then, lastly, if I can just get, here is the mitigation opportunity language. So threat modeling takes a lot of time, and there's a lot of data. So when there's a lot of data in anything, it does take a lot of time. But there's opportunities where what you want to do is to be able to integrate a lot of, and you can do this manually, you can do this on your own. A lot of the tools that you might be using today have open APIs. And so that you can basically contextualize your threat model so that it can basically, be data enriched. Now, there's some resources here for you. There's an ebook that you can download. It's there on the site. You can just go, you can literally Google Pasta ebook, and you'll be taken probably much to the same place. There's a blog that kind of walks through the 7 steps, but the ebook is a good, desk side reference on risk-centric threat models. It's free. The other one is the Fork YouTube walkthrough. So if you're interested on a free tool for doing risk-based threat models, it has all that data. If you're doing especially like a new product development effort, and you kind of want to see what sort of attack patterns and weaknesses you should be concerned about from the get-go, it's really, really beneficial there, and it's absolutely free. So you can check that out. There is a YouTube on that. The best place to go and take a test drive is forktm.com. I don't have that on there on this here, but if you go to the Fork community GitHub, you're going to get some free threat libraries. Now, we've developed the threat libraries that have been developed have been inspired and fed by threat intel research. So, what we're looking to do is get a global community to help contribute. So work with maybe Google Mandiant or, some of the other places like maybe Recorded Future or, Arctic Wolf. I mean, it doesn't really matter who the players are, but everyone is seeing something, right? And so for us to be able to contribute and say, these are threats that we're seeing that are happening in the industry, we've created a data structure, with JSON that maps everything out and encompasses a lot of the taxonomies there. So I'm going to pause for any questions. I really do appreciate the opportunity to talk to you about this. And hopefully this was something that you can take back and make useful in your respective threat modeling efforts going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Tony, for another enlightening task. Listening to your talk was a pleasure and very insightful for me. And it looks like also our audience was quite inspired by your presentation. So I actually have a couple of questions from them. Are you ready to go?
Yes, absolutely.
Let's get going then. I'll start with a couple of questions in the area that are related to the data sources you mentioned. One comes, and I think they kind of are looking for advice on how to get hold of data and the data you mentioned. So how would you try to get a SOC to share its data with people that actually do threat modeling, given that that data may be treated as confidential, I guess?
Yeah, a security operations center, you mean?
Yes, sorry, sure, yes, I guess, or I interpreted as that.
Yeah, practically speaking, like, so for example, I'll take Splunk because, Splunk is one of the bigger heavy players out there, and but it doesn't matter what you're using in terms of a SIM, if it's Alien Vault or QRadar or anything else. Basically, you have those alerts that are happening are usually tied to a domain. They're tied to something, some sort of organizational structure. Like in Splunk, they have what's called an application ID. And you can have events or incidents that are happening, again, across the full stack at the network layer, domain level, cloud environment level, maybe some of the identity stores like Azure AD or now Intra, where there's some violations that are captured by your SIM that the SOC is monitoring. Part of evangelizing this integration process does require some level of kind of having an open conversation with the SOC leaders and say, listen, right now you're responding to alerts, you have your SLAs, but what we want to do is we want to be able to make your operational group to have a lot more visibility, right? Because if you think about traditional enterprise security, most people look at SOC as like the people just with the headsets that are just closing tickets, right? It's not, but when they have the opportunity to raise the level of importance of what they do, usually the owners of a SOC or the leaders of a SOC are going to be genuinely interested in getting a lot more visibility in an enterprise security program, because it's going to take them from being, and I hate to use this word because again, I've been a SOC analyst, but they're kind of looked like just like a blue collar worker just closing tickets. And that's not, they're the first line of defense, and the organization needs to understand that. So if they can look through what they've closed and what they've addressed in their SOC analysis and work efforts and reconcile that to an established threat model at an organizational level or for a product, let's say there's a flagship product, then it's in the best interest of a SOC leader to be like, yeah, I'll share you some threat data, right? This is meant to be internal within the organization. If you have a managed SOC service or an MDR, then you have a contractual opportunity where you can tell your managed detection and response partner or MSSP to say, listen, we've built an application threat model. This is really important for us. Here are some non-negotiables. Our threat library is really concerned on, people trying to do illicit financial transactions, right? So we want you to be able to see what threat campaigns are coming in through OpenCTI or threat feeds that you're getting as a SOC to let us know that there's campaigns that are really increasing in ACH fraud, wire transfer fraud, Swift, fraudulent Swift transfers, etc. So I think, it's really goes back to messaging. The SOC leaders would be a little bit kind of, nearsighted if they didn't see the opportunity for them to raise the visibility and importance of that SOC to the overall enterprise.
Understood. Thanks. Great. I have two questions that are quite close to each other. One is from VerSprite. The other one was mentioned by MS. So the question there is, what approaches make sense to gather data on third-party applications where the vendor may not be open to disclosing a lot of details, or as MS put it, well, how to get an SBOM from a vendor before signing a contract? What would be your approach there?
That's a great question. And so here is a practical recommendation. So I have had experiences where, there is a third party that has proprietary software that their software is running maybe as a core engine to the overall application within an application threat model. So it is very much a black box. And so to Fields Rhodes' question, how do you get them to open up the kimono? Like if they're not sharing an SBOM to you, or they're not sharing their own internal threat model of that particular product, how do you basically get them to really respect the threat model that you're building? And here's a couple of suggestions. Number one is that I would build a threat model in the environment that encompasses that third-party product. Recognizing that it is closed or black box, you would want to start to do some suppositions or theories on what sort of things that, like implicit trust, poor validation, privilege escalation, that would be carried over into the broader application that could really jeopardize the security or a lot of the objectives for the application model. So if you, for example, say, well, I want to be able to, get them to at least answer that the context in which they are running their software is under this security context, and it's a deprecated security context. Or if it's running as an elevated security context, then they would at least respond and say, yes, you asking me if this particular third-party software that we authored is running in an elevated context, and they would say yes or no to that. Now, it's all going to really hinge to something called right to audit clauses and contractual agreements. So if you had a third or fourth party where the language in those relationships doesn't have good legal language for right to audit, you're not going to get a lot of information. And so in that sense, what do you do with your threat model? Well, you assume the worst, right? So that means that assuming the worst, anything that you get back from that component, you want to be able to make sure that you're doing the level of data validation in that data stream, that if there is a call flow programmatically, that you're doing some level of validation against, like, it could be something as simple as, geo IP, maybe from a whitelist, or maybe there's a digital cert, maybe there's a specific hash or a token that was basically, defined. You can do levels of re-authentication for sensitive transactions, so transaction-based authentication, so that you can elevate some of the concerns, right? And that's in your jurisdiction of application ownership to do with the inclusion of that third-party product.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Then from a question from Anna, quite interesting to hear more from you about that. Can you elaborate on how SPA scans can help with threat modeling? Is it not just mixing threat modeling with an operational control we have in place? So SPA being mainly the result of threat modeling, figuring out by threat modeling that there should be a control that does SCA. What are
SCA, like software composition analysis?
Yes, exactly, like dependency scanning for vulnerabilities, I guess.
Yeah, SCA today, is, there's a lot of places that are definitely automating that, and with CI/CD tooling, so that when environments are built, there is a automatic process to understand what am I running in terms of insecure libraries and insecure dependencies. That is going to feed stage 5 of a risk-centric threat model, where it looks at vulnerability analysis. So vulnerabilities in the software, vulnerabilities in the environment, right? So if let's say that you're concerned about persistence, and there is a third-party JavaScript library that allows for arbitrary command injection or for privilege escalation, then the SCA activity that's done typically nowadays through some level of automation is going to produce results. And those results, if those results are in the attack surface of the application being threat modeled, then they provide a lot of valuable information in terms of weaknesses or vulnerabilities through third-party packages that could actually help realize the threat objective and that threat of persistence, as an example. So threat modeling oftentimes is looked upon as like, in our industry in security, we do a lot of what I call security islands. Patty's going to do vuln management. Sven is going to do pen testing. I'm going to do governance, right? But there's no cohesiveness, right? And then with SCA, DAS, and SAS, there's, this group is doing this group is doing that. A lot of people are taking threat modeling and creating yet another security island called threat modeling. But threat modeling has an opportunity to be actually the I wouldn't say that, the boat or the frame that encompasses a lot of these activities, like SCA scanning, like SAS scanning, like DAS scanning, so that the threats that you're concerned about are basically going to be substantiated by the information output that you have from some of these activities in SCA, in DAS, in SAS, etc.
Okay. Yeah. I think there's a nice follow-up question for that from Nat, and I'm interpreting a bit now to kind of extend the question at the end, but let's see. So Nat asks, how often do you think we have to repeat the threat modeling exercise to stay secure? And how do you manage to not forgetting it? Because I think the questions come from the line that often threat modeling is done at, start of a project, then you do your threat modeling, then you define a couple of controls or countermeasures, and then you go operational and, things stay as they are. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, and so there's a couple different criteria. One, and unfortunately, we're all trying to get to a point of automation, but if there's certain use cases in the application model that are added to, it's a good opportunity to, look at the threat model as a whole and how those extra features or use cases are going to influence the overall threat model. I'll just name one example, in the attack surface, right? If the attack surface is expanded now because we have a new set of web frameworks or micro frameworks that are being used, then obviously now we have another part of to protect, right? So from just the attack surface standpoint, it warrants revisiting the threat model. Use cases, right? So if how many times do you see like an e-commerce site that begins by outsourcing a lot of the payment processing with a third-party partner, right? But let's say for whatever reason, they want to do away with that and they want to build their own payment gateway and their own payment processing. Obviously, the use case of that changes and warrants a threat model, right? And then the other aspect is if there's changes in roles and permissions. So if for whatever reason, if the security context of a caller in the application model is elevated, then we need to see, what other things is that caller doing in the application model to see that it can't, undermine, other requests that it is making to other components. But, there's no exact science. Those are three good ones, I would say, because I think that if you do that, it provides a conditional as to when you need to revisit your threat model and do it up to date. I think the future, one of the things that we're talking about in global OWASP circles is to be able to come up with the ability to have threat modeling as code and to be able to diff your threat models over time, to do a technical differentiating comparison on structured data sets with a structured language, which I introduced that subject literally like 10 years ago outside of London in a workshop. It was kind of looked upon not in the most favorable way, but now I think with all the fervor with automation, a lot of people are saying that, hey, there's some value in some level of automation, diffing threat models.
Mm-hmm. That's a nice point to step in. You mentioned threat modeling in code, and we have the question here of how technical should a threat model be?
I mean, that's a good question. I think there's layers. I think the threat library should be pretty agnostic to technical prowess. So I think the threat model, the threat library brings a lot of people to the table. And I think the technical conversations, if you go back to the data, start to go into like, attack patterns and vulnerability patterns and, attack component libraries that, are technical in nature. And, it's really not meant for the audiences of maybe a product owner or a business person or even like a compliance person. Everyone kind of just wants to know how the application threat model is enforcing or negating their own particular objectives. But the threat library should be pretty agnostic. Today, a lot of people using Stride, they are keeping it all very technical. So your audiences are very limited. And as a result, when you're trying to champion threat model into other different groups, we like, as an example, let's take the video gaming industry. Video game, so you have a security enterprise group that says, let's protect digital assets, yay. But then there's the publishing groups that they're doing the creative content. They're doing the cool designs and the new, video games. They don't care about security. They just care about player experience. So if you're basically just speaking in your vernacular, you're not going to be able to speak on terms that publishing house, that asset creator is actually doing. So I think to answer your question, there's certain levels that it should be agnostic to. It should be open to everyone in terms of the communication. And that's really at the threat library level. And then when it comes to understanding the viability of attacks, attack patterns, post-exploitation patterns and stuff like that, those are things that, in fact, I will mention on the Git hub for VerSprite, there is a free RACI diagram that you can download that kind of shows who should be involved at what stage and when, and are they responsible or accountable, consulted or informed. So definitely check that out.
Which brings us to the next question directly, where they ask, well, who should be in the lead of creating such threat models and who should be involved? So can you still elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, I think the ideal person to do a threat modeling exercise is actually someone that is, technical inclination within the product team, development team. They don't have to be a developer. They could even be a QA person, right? But they have to have enough technical understanding about what some of the components that the development team, the engineers are actually working with. Because if we get someone that is non-technical, they're going to lose the respect of a lot of the stakeholders that are building this product out. So at the flip side, if you get somebody that's overly technical and doesn't really do a good job of really deriving what is impactful, especially if you're doing a risk-centric approach, right? You want someone to be able to understand at the end of the day, there's a go-to-market strategy for this product. What are the goals, right? That would, if something bad were to happen, how would that affect the product, even the product longevity? Some products like Cloud Pets went out of business shortly thereafter that breach, right? So there's a role called security champion. I think the characteristics of a great security champion have definitely, I would say 60% strong roots in technical prowess, understanding, development frameworks, understands, how to represent a call flow or what is a data flow, understands, things like authorization and authentication. I think more than the security aspect, the functional understanding is more important in my personal opinion.
Yeah. Understood. Very good. When we think about threat modeling, well, it costs money. So we have to convince management to push or at least pay for threat modeling. How can this be done, given that they seem to be much more inclined to spend money for penetration testing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the answer to that is, I'll give two answers to that. I was in a threat modeling exercise with a major financial institution, and I was with the security team, and they were talking to their internal customer that was the product owner for an application. And at the kickoff of the threat modeling, kickoff, I said, listen, we know that you've received audit reports, vulnerability reports, DAS scans, SAS scans, and you have to make sense of it all. What we're bringing to you is that we're going to take all of those things and help you prioritize them in a model of threats based upon your deployment model, what your product does, who this serves, and the data that you're managing. We're going to help you we're going to ingest those things, and we're going to help you prioritize so that you can basically understand what is the threats that you should be concerned about and how the things that were found actually support the viability of those threats in occurring. And they were like, oh, so you're doing my job for me. That's awesome, because I need to focus on product development. That's what I'm hired to do, right? I'm not hired to basically look at 10 different security reports. That's why they hate us, right? I mean, we're not very popular at the Christmas parties. So that's one answer. The other answer is, if you have a boss or a CISO or that says, hey, we're paying for pen testing, that's enough. Okay. Most pen testers, when they go through a standard methodology of like OSINT, fingerprinting, banner grabbing, discovery, vuln analysis, exploitation. But if that adversarial engagement, if it's mapped to a threat model of like, okay, hey boss, you know that we're in the consumer electronic space. 2 of our competitors were just in the news. The details on their incidents were like this, and they were really after, let's say, credentials, or they were after our accounts. So we're going to take the pen test that we're doing, and we're going to have them, do adversarial simulation on account exfiltration. What do you think? I mean, it's a no-brainer. They're going to be like, okay, wait, 2 of our competitors just got compromised in this area. And again, that's threat intel, right? And instead of just doing, the normal pen test, most pen testers, especially if you're running a bug bounty program, guess what the researcher's looking for? Payout. That's it. They don't care about a threat model. They just want to be able to find something that's going to pay them $3,000 or $2,000 or something that's going to be meaningful. And so but when you start to build an application threat model and you say, we built an application threat model, we gave it to 2 or 3 or 4 of our pen testers and say, you guys do your regular thing, but hey, begin by really trying to throw the kitchen sink at trying to see the viability for these threat patterns. Then what you're doing is you're getting your pen testers to go above and beyond just simply OSINT, fingerprint grabbing, discovery, right? They go through this repetitive process. We want them to think like criminals and to be able to emulate criminal intent that's happening. So.
I see. And is this also the way how you make sure that a threat model is not just a theoretical exercise, but is actually something useful and tangible, or is there more to it?
That's absolutely, that's the whole point. Marco then was the SVP for Citigroup in London, and I was a senior director at a Fortune 50 in risk. And we were tired of the theoretical in security, right? And there's a lot of just theoretical suppositions, a lot of fear mongering, that is done to product owners and technology owners, and they get desensitized. So once you prove that you have a component within an application attack surface, and you show that it has an associated weakness and exploitability is possible, and it ties to a threat that would affect the business, there is a product owner, developer, everyone is like, okay, we get it. We're going to do it. That's it. End of story, right? It's the smoking gun. A lot of the threat modeling that happens today goes back to that Dilbert cartoon, right? That I opened up with in the background. It says, this is the information we need to go to war. And it's just trying to I don't know, just legitimize an activity that honestly, if I was a CEO of that organization and spending for those activities to be done, I want as much proof as I can to, and this goes back to the data reliability, that I actually have a problem. Don't tell me CVSS scores of 9.8 or EPSS score of something else, because CVSS and EPSS and MITRE does not know my multi-billion-dollar or multi-million-dollar business and or tech stack, right? So context is only going to come from good data.
I see. Yes, yes. By the way, do you know of any numbers that can prove that we can actually save money when doing threat modeling? Any studies, any data published or something like that?
Not yet, but hopefully with the so VerSprite is now, we've released this fork enterprise product. I think, give us 10 years, and like most product companies, we should have the opportunity to have the data science, behind it, where we might have a sample size of X, and then see how it's being used, how it's being represented. We do know that GitLab, if you Google GitLab threat modeling and Pasta, they had a really nice write-up of how and why they picked Pasta as their base threat modeling methodology for threat modeling activities at GitLab. And they're a pretty technical organization. Now, in terms of empirical studies and KPIs, I think that we're not there yet. I think that we have the opportunity to get there, as we, every product that's out there has the opportunity to do some level of data science, and see how the threat modeling activities are truly saving, time and money, and finding things earlier.
Yeah, I see. Cool. Thanks a lot. I think I can start to closing the Q&A session with a pretty nice question from Jim that brings us back to the roots of your talk, actually. Well, he asks, I'm sure there's a story behind how you came up with Pasta. Not sure whether he means the word or whatever, but right?
Yeah, there is. I mean, I think I probably have a unhealthy appreciation for food. And, so my background is part Italian from Napoli. My parents are from South America, and there's a lot of Italians in South America. But Marco is 100% Italian. I think he's from Northern Italy. So, what's the methodology if it doesn't have a good acronym or, a mnemonic? So I think, we just landed on, the process of attack simulation and threat analysis was really meant to prove that there's a problem, right? And so we want to simulate that there are attack patterns. And then, but we also want to be able to leverage in threat information and correlate that to basically call something risky. But I don't know, maybe we were eating a bowl of pasta, maybe a bowl of, manicotti or something. So that could have inspired it. Who knows?
Cool. Thanks a lot. So with this, I'd like to conclude this event. A very big thank you again, Tony, for your talk and for taking your time to share your insight with us regarding threat modeling. Also, a big thank you to everyone for being here and staying put. I hope to see you all on the 5th of June on the OWASP Switzerland Summit in Zurich. And I wish you all a nice weekend and goodbye.
Thank you.